Welcome back, everyone. For today's deep dive, we're taking a closer look at forgiveness, specifically through the lens of Allan Kardec's The Gospel According to the Spirits, as requested by some of you. Now, I'll admit, when I first picked this up, it wasn't quite what I expected.
Yeah, you could say that. Kardec's work is a little different. It's based on the idea of actually communicating with spirits to gain insights into morality, philosophy, the big stuff.
Definitely not your average self-help book.
No, not really.
So what really jumped out at you in this whole idea of forgiving others equals forgiving ourselves? I mean, it sounds pretty straightforward at first, but Kardec really seems to take it to another level.
Yeah, and what I find really interesting is that Kardec doesn't just present it as, a nice thing to do. He actually suggests there's a spiritual mechanism at play here. He says that God's forgiveness is directly tied to our own willingness to forgive others.
Oh, right. He even pulls in that passage from Matthew, right?
Yeah, exactly. Matthew 6.1-15, where it says that if you forgive other people when they sin against you, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. But if you do not forgive others their sins, your Father will not forgive your sins.
Yeah. But honestly, 70 times 7, how much can one person really be expected to forgive? What about when someone does something really awful? There's got to be a limit.
Well, that's where Kardec gets really interesting, I think. He's clear that it's not about, keeping score or letting people off the hook. It's about a true change of heart. True forgiveness is about letting go of the resentment, not just saying the words and then secretly holding on to all that anger and hurt.
Okay, so it's more about an internal shift than just outward actions.
Exactly.
That makes sense, but man, it sounds really tough.
It is. And it kind of leads to another point that Kardec makes about, there being a right way and a wrong way to forgive. He talks about how true forgiveness is different from the kind that's all about humiliation and control.
Oh, yeah. The kind of forgiveness that's more like a power trip, than an actual genuine attempt at reconciliation.
Yeah, exactly. And Kardec really digs into that, the psychology behind it, by emphasizing humility. True forgiveness requires letting go of that need to be right or to feel superior.
It's recognizing our own imperfections and our own need for mercy, I guess.
Absolutely.
So it's like true forgiveness is impossible without humility, right? Those two things have to go together.
They really do. And speaking of recognizing our own imperfections, Kardec uses this analogy that's really stuck with me, that of the speck and the plank. How we're all so focused on the tiny flaws in others, but we're blind to our own much bigger ones.
Oh, I love that one. It's so true. We're all experts at pointing out other people's specks, but totally oblivious to our own giant planks.
Right. And Kardec connects this to the theme of judgment. He says that our pride actually blinds us to our own shortcomings, which then makes us more likely to judge other people harshly.
So the more judgmental we are, the less self-aware we probably are. It makes you wonder what planks we might all be carrying that are preventing us from truly forgiving others, and maybe even ourselves.
That's a great question.
And maybe an even better question is, how can we actually apply all of this to real life?
Definitely. And Kardec actually uses a really compelling example from the Bible, the story of the woman caught in adultery.
Oh, yeah. The one where she's brought before Jesus and she's totally vulnerable, facing this harsh judgment, and then, boom, Jesus throws everyone a curveball with his response.
It's such a dramatic scene. And what I think is fascinating is that Kardec doesn't see it as condoning what she did.
Yeah.
He sees it more as a powerful critique of self-righteousness. Jesus isn't excusing the sin. He's challenging the hypocrisy of her accusers.
Yeah, it's that whole he who is without sin thing.
Exactly.
What a powerful reminder that we all need grace.
Right. And Kardec ties this back to his whole message of indulgence. We need to cultivate more mercy, both towards ourselves and others, remembering that none of us are perfect.
It reminds me of something a spirit named Joseph said, indulgence is calming and uplifting while sternness discourages. So it seems like we have a choice to approach ourselves and each other with kindness and understanding, or with criticism and judgment.
And that choice, according to Kardec, has some pretty big implications for our own spiritual growth. But what does that actually look like? How do we put this into practice and cultivate more genuine indulgence? That's what we'll be exploring next.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground. The spiritual mechanics of forgiveness, the importance of humility, the need for indulgence. But how do we actually cultivate this genuine indulgence that Kardec keeps talking about? How do we actually do it?
Yeah, that's where I think Kardec's insights become so valuable because he doesn't just leave us with these big ideas, you know?
Mhm.
He gives us some actual guidance on how to live these principles out in our everyday lives.
That's what I like to hear, especially because, let's be honest, forgiveness is hard. It's easy to say forgive and forget, but actually putting it into practice, especially when someone's really hurt us, well, that's a whole different story.
Absolutely. And Kardec gets that. He understands that struggle, and he's very clear that forgiveness is an active process, not a passive one. It's not about just pushing down your anger or pretending that something didn't happen. It's about actively transforming our hearts.
So it's more than just saying, I forgive you through gritted teeth. What does that heart transformation actually look like?
Well, there was a spirit communicating through a medium back in 1862 in Bordeaux who identified himself as Simeon. He talked about the need to cultivate what he called forgetfulness of self, which would make us invulnerable to attack, evil behavior, and insult.
Forgetfulness of self. That sounds almost superhuman, like completely letting go of our egos.
It's a high bar, for sure. But think about the freedom that would come with it. If we could truly let go of the need to be right, to be the victim, how much lighter our hearts would feel.
Okay, I get it. I see why that would be amazing. But how do we even begin to get close to that kind of letting go, especially when we're dealing with, real pain, real hurt?
Kardec makes it clear that true forgiveness is something that we see reflected in our actions, not just in our thoughts. He actually says, and I'm paraphrasing here, true forgiveness is recognized by actions much more than by words.
So it's not enough to just think forgiving thoughts. We have to actually change how we act.
Yeah. If we're still acting out of resentment, then we haven't truly forgiven. There was a spirit, he identified as Paul the Apostle, communicating through a medium in Lyon in 1861 who said that true forgiveness, Christian forgiveness, is the kind that casts a veil over the past. It is the only kind that will be credited to you, for God is not satisfied with appearances.
So it's like choosing to rewrite the story in a way, to focus on the possibility of healing and moving forward instead of just dwelling on the past.
Yes. And that ties back to the importance of humility. We talked about that earlier. To really forgive, we have to humble ourselves, acknowledge our own imperfections, and realize that we need forgiveness too.
Right, right. It's like that saying, you can't love others until you love yourself. Maybe it's also true that you can't truly forgive others until you forgive yourself.
That's a great point. And a spirit identifying himself as Jean, Bishop of Bordeaux, in 1862, actually said something similar. He said that the Lord will show indulgence toward you to the degree that you have shown indulgence toward others.
So it's like a mirror, almost. The way we treat other people is a reflection of how we treat ourselves. Which makes me wonder, what kind of reflection do we want to see?
That's a really good question. It's easy to fall into the trap of judging other people, holding grudges, and dwelling on past hurts. But Kardec reminds us that that path just leads to suffering, both for ourselves and the people around us.
So choosing forgiveness, even when it's really hard, is ultimately an act of self-love as much as it's an act of love for others.
Exactly. And that brings us to another really important distinction that Kardec makes. The difference between indulgence and sternness.
Right. You mentioned earlier what that spirit Joseph said about how indulgence is calming and uplifting, while sternness discourages. I wonder if that applies to how we treat ourselves too, not just how we treat other people.
Absolutely. Kardec actually seems to be suggesting that we often show more grace and understanding to other people than we do to ourselves. He actually challenges us to be stern toward ourselves and indulgent toward others, which, to be honest, feels a little backwards at first.
Yeah, it goes against our natural tendency to beat ourselves up, doesn't it? We set these impossible standards and then dwell on our mistakes.
It's like we're constantly carrying around all this self-judgment, and that makes it almost impossible to offer true forgiveness to other people, too. I mean, how can we extend compassion to others if we can't even give it to ourselves, right?
So maybe the first step to truly forgiving others is learning how to forgive ourselves. That makes a lot of sense. But how? How do we even begin to do that?
Well, Kardec suggests that it starts with cultivating a more gentle and compassionate inner voice. Challenging that inner critic, remembering that we're human, and offering ourselves the same kindness and understanding that we'd offer a good friend.
So we need to become our own best friend, basically, offering ourselves support and encouragement instead of all that criticism. It's definitely easier said than done, but I can see how that shift in mindset would make a huge difference in our ability to forgive others.
Absolutely. And Kardec actually takes it even further. He says that people who see themselves as morally superior to others are foolish and at fault. He's really challenging that whole idea of self-righteousness.
It's a good reminder that we're all in this together, flawed and imperfect. We all need each other's grace and understanding to learn and grow.
Exactly. And I think that gets to the heart of Kardec's message about forgiveness. It's rooted in humility, in understanding our shared humanity and our shared need for grace.
We're all on this journey of self-improvement, making mistakes along the way. And instead of judging each other for our stumbles, we should offer support and encouragement.
That's beautifully put. That's really the essence of Kardec's message. Forgiveness isn't just a nice idea. It's a fundamental spiritual practice that can truly transform us, both individually and collectively.
This has been such an eye-opening deep dive into the world of forgiveness, especially from Kardec's spiritual perspective. I feel like I'm leaving with a much deeper understanding of what true forgiveness actually means, not just as an idea, but as a way of life.
That's great to hear. And remember, forgiveness is a journey, not a destination. We're all works in progress. The important thing is to keep practicing, keep working towards that transformation of the heart, and keep extending grace, both to ourselves and others.
So it's about choosing love over judgment, understanding over condemnation, and ultimately choosing freedom over resentment.
Yeah, I love that. And to quote a spirit who identified as John, Bishop of Bordeaux, he said this, and I'm paraphrasing here, "The way is illuminated for those who practice forgiveness, and throughout their entire journey, they can read these words that point to the means for them to reach the end. Practical charity, charity of the heart, charity toward one's neighbors and toward oneself. In other words, charity toward all, and love for God above all things, because love for God summarizes all duties, and it is impossible to love him truly without practicing charity, which he made into a law for all his creatures."
Wow, what a message to remember. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into forgiveness. We hope it sparked some new ideas for you and maybe even inspired you to embark on your own journey of forgiveness for yourself and for others.
Until next time.
Keep diving deep. Okay, so let's sit down to brass tacks here. How do we actually apply these forgiveness principles in real life? I mean, it's one thing to talk about forgetfulness of self and heart transformation, but actually putting them into practice when you're in the thick of it, that's got to be a whole different ballgame.
Oh, absolutely. And that's what I think is so cool about Kardec's work. He doesn't just leave us hanging with these big ideas. He provides actual real-world guidance on how to navigate these messy human relationships.
So let's get specific then. What kind of practical advice does he give?
Well, one question he addresses is, is it ever okay to reprimand someone for their wrongdoing, even if we're trying to forgive them? I mean, does holding someone accountable kind of go against the idea of grace?
Yeah, that's a tough one. It's like, how do you balance calling out harmful behavior without slipping into judgment and condemnation?
Exactly. And a spirit communicating through a medium in Paris in 1860 who identified as St. Louis said that, yeah, we should definitely be working towards the progress of others, but reprimands should be given in moderation and with a helpful purpose, not for the sake of just tearing someone down.
So it's about offering constructive criticism, not like a character assassination, right? Focusing on the behavior and not the person.
Exactly. And St. Louis really stresses that the most effective criticism comes from a place of humility. He even suggests asking ourselves, do I deserve this criticism more than the person I'm about to reprimand?
Whoa. Talk about a dose of reality.
Right.
It's like that saying, judge not lest you be judged. Kardec's really pushing us to examine our own motivations before we point fingers at other people.
Yeah. And he even goes on to say that if someone's flaws are only hurting themselves, then there's no need to, air their dirty laundry in public. But if their actions are negatively impacting others, then it might be necessary to step in.
So it's a judgment call, but one that should be made with compassion and a focus on, minimizing harm.
Exactly. St. Louis warns against disclosing someone's wrongdoings for malicious reasons or just for the satisfaction of being right. It's not about winning or proving a point. It's about what's best for everyone involved.
This whole conversation is making me realize how often our egos get in the way of true forgiveness, we'd rather be right than actually reconcile.
Yeah, it's a common struggle. And it brings us right back to that core principle of indulgence. Remember, nobody's perfect. We all need grace and understanding. And that includes ourselves.
That including ourselves part is always the hardest part to swallow.
It is. We tend to hold ourselves to these crazy high standards, beat ourselves up for past mistakes, and just dwell on all our flaws. It's like we're always carrying around this huge weight of self-judgment.
Yeah, and that makes it pretty tough to offer genuine forgiveness to anyone else, doesn't it? It's like we're trying to help someone else while we're, drowning ourselves.
Exactly. That's why Kardec emphasizes self-forgiveness so much. There was a spirit He identified himself as Dufetre, Bishop of Nevers, and he said something that really stuck with me. He said, and I'm paraphrasing here, all of you have evil tendencies to overcome, defects to correct, and habits to change. All of you have a burden that is heavier or less heavy, but which you must get rid of in order to scale the peak of the mountain of progress.
Wow. What a powerful image. It's like we're all on this climb, each of us with our own burdens to carry. But instead of judging each other for how heavy our loads are, we should be offering support and encouragement.
That's exactly it. And Kardec talks about how we need to uphold the strong and strengthen the weak, reminding us that even the tiniest bit of repentance is valuable in God's eyes. It's about creating a culture of compassion and growth, both for ourselves and for the people around us.
This has been such a fascinating look at forgiveness, especially through Kardec's unique spiritual perspective. I feel like I have a much better grasp of what true forgiveness really means. It's not just an idea, it's a way of living.
I'm glad to hear that. And remember, this is a journey, not a destination. We're all a work in progress, always learning. The key is to keep practicing, keep working towards that change of heart, and keep offering grace to ourselves and everyone around us.
It's about choosing love over judgment, understanding over condemnation, and in the end, choosing freedom over resentment.
Beautifully said. And I'll leave you with this from a spirit who identified as Jean, Bishop of Bordeaux, who said that the way is illuminated for those who practice forgiveness. And throughout the entire journey, they can read these words that point to the means for them to reach the end. Practical charity, charity of the heart, charity toward one's neighbors and toward oneself. In other words, charity toward all and love for God above all things, because love for God summarizes all duties, and it is impossible to love him truly without practicing charity, which he made into a law for all his creatures.
What a powerful message. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive into forgiveness. We hope it's given you some new things to think about and maybe even inspired you to start your own journey of forgiveness, both for yourselves and for others.
Until next time.
Keep diving deep.